Okay, today, this is the last commune of the 5 groups that I'm presenting. And you'll see very quickly that it's a very different communal experience than any of the others. And one thing has to do with no authoritarian leader involved, essentially. And it produces a very different kind of experience. Now, what I'm going to present is the way Koinonia Farm, from its founding in 1942 until the early 60s, because their communal pattern ended in the early 1960s when they decided to give families a monthly allowance rather than make all the decisions communally. But I think you'll be struck a little bit with the origins of the impulses to found Koinonia Farm as well. Now, I should tell you today, I'm going to be pretty heavily reading my notes. And part of that is because I'm going to share with you some extended quotes that come out of newspapers and encounters that happened that were written down. So let me begin. In 1997, in early 1997, I had an opportunity to have an extended recorded interview with Millard Fuller. Now, how many of you are Habitat for Humanity folks? He was in one of the western suburbs of Cleveland for some event, and because I wanted to do Koinonia as part of the doctoral project, he gave me an extended interview, and it was very enlightening, and I'll share some of what he said in my remarks today. Koinonia Farm was founded as a biracial commune near Americus, Georgia in 1942. And the vision for this experiment, and it really was an experiment, for this experimenting community came from the work of Clarence Jordan. Many of you may be familiar with Clarence Jordan as the author of a version of the Gospels called the Cotton Patch version of the New Testament. And I had a tape of Jordan sharing the Good Samaritan story, and I can't find the tape. But I will read to you his version of the Good Samaritan story in the Cotton Patch Gospel. This is a quote from him. One day, a teacher of an adult Bible class got up and tested Jesus with this question: "Doctor, what does one do to be saved?" Jesus replied, "What does the Bible say? How do you interpret it?" The teacher answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your physical strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "That's correct," Jesus said. "Make a habit of this and you'll be saved." But the Sunday school teacher, trying to save face, asked, "But who is my neighbor?" Then Jesus laid into it and said, "A man was going from Atlanta to Albany, and some gangsters held him up. When they robbed him of his wallet and his brand new suit, they beat him up and drove off in his car, leaving him unconscious on the shoulder of the highway. Now, it just so happened that a white preacher was going down the same highway. When he saw the fellow, he stepped on the gas and went scooting by. His homiletical mind probably made the following outline: I do not know the man. 2, I do not wish to get involved in any court proceedings. 3, I don't want to get blood on my new upholstery. 4, the man's lack of proper clothing would embarrass me upon arrival in town. And 5, finally, brethren, a minister must never be late for worship services." Shortly afterwards, a white gospel song leader came down the road, and when he saw what had happened, he too stepped on the gas. What his thoughts were, we'll never know, but as he whizzed by, he may have been whistling "Right in the Corner Where You Are." Then a black man traveling that way came upon the fellow, and what he saw moved him to tears. He stopped and bound up his wounds as best he could, drew some water from his water jug to wipe away the blood, and laid him on the back seat. All the while his thoughts may have been along this line. Somebody's robbed you. Yeah, I know about that. I've been robbed too. And they done beat you up bad. I know, I've been beat up too. And everybody just go right on by and leave you laying there hurting. Yeah, I know. They passed me by too. He drove on into Albany and took him to the hospital and said to the nurse, "You take good care of this white man I found on the highway. Here's the only $2 I got, but you all keep account of what he owes, and if he can't pay, I'll settle up with you when I make a payday." Now, if you've been the man held up by the gangsters, which of these three, the white preacher, the white song leader, or the black man, would you consider have been your neighbor? The teacher of the adult Bible class said, well, of course, the one who treated me kindly. Jesus said, well, then you get going and start living like that. That's his version of the Good Samaritan. Koinonia Farm really began because of Clarence Jordan's impulse. The first experience which Jordan had and later interpreted as being fundamental to his understanding and his impulse to found Koinonia Farm happened when he was a young man, a youth, probably around 13 years old, about the time he was baptized. He was raised in a well-to-do home. His father was a prosperous businessman who owned a town store and bank, but their residence was next to the county jail. Jordan was able to observe that most of the prisoners were poor and black, and that they were often mistreated by the jailers. One evening, following a revival meeting, Jordan remembers hearing the cries of one of the inmates who had been tortured on the stretcher, which is a form of the rack. Jordan recalls recognizing the voice of the inmate being tortured as one of the individuals he knew, and he recalls recognizing the torturer, a white jailer who hours before had been carried away in singing a choir solo of "Love Lifted Me" at the revival. The moral dissonance which he experienced because of this juxtaposition of events would lead to a lifelong concern on the part of Jordan for racial justice and equality. His interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan carries the flavor of his concern in this area. The second formative event, which led to Jordan's passion for economic sharing and justice, was the collapse of his family's fortune in March of 1933 because of the Depression. Jordan already had a deep concern for the poor tenant farmers that he knew, which he observed during his youth. In fact, he went to college majoring in agriculture, hoping to help improve the lot of tenant farmers by helping them improve their farming methods. During the first years of his college experience, he was carefree and full of life. But during the concluding year of college, his father's business finally succumbed to the pressures of what was going on in the Depression, and he experienced firsthand the reality of financial hardship. One of his concerns throughout his adult life was the search for a more equitable economic sharing and structure of production of goods. The third formative event in Jordan's life was a confrontation with conscience that he experienced during ROTC. He was in summer training following his senior year in college. He'd been reading his New Testament, and he'd been committing large portions of it to his memory. Again, it was the dissonance between what he was seeing in the New Testament and what he was told to be doing as a soldier, which caused him to break ranks and drop out of maneuvers. He could not follow Jesus and participate in killing his fellow man. Jordan was a man who refused to live with logical inconsistencies. In addition to his passion for racial equality and economic justice, he was opposed to violence as inconsistent with Jesus' teachings. When Jordan was a young boy, his family always assumed he would probably grow up to be a lawyer because he was verbally combative. While he was led to follow a different path, his verbal combativeness continued. He had a style that would be described as in your face. For example, he was known to walk into a home of a wealthy individual and say, "Nice bit of plunder you got here." In an argument with his brother Robert, who was an attorney, over Robert's refusal to represent Koinonia Farm, Jordan is reported to have said, "I don't believe you're a disciple. You're an admirer of Jesus, but not a disciple. I think you ought to go back to church you belong to and tell them you're an admirer, not a disciple." His inclination was not to run from conflict, but to stand his ground, sometimes in the face of violent threats, and speak the truth in love. The newsletter which Koinonia Farm sent to supporters contained a report of one of these confrontations. During the economic boycott of Koinonia Farm in 1956, when the local butane dealer refused to sell, Clarence and others confronted the man. And this is their conversation when he confronted the butane dealer who wouldn't sell to them. We said our major concern was not to get gas for ourselves, but for the welfare of his soul. We asked if his action was due to any fault on our part, and he said no, and that's what made it so hard for him. We asked why he had done it, and he said he was afraid of the pressure. We asked how many customers he lost on account of us, and he said none. We asked him who was putting pressure on him, and he said nobody yet. We said we thought he had given up too easily and was not exhibiting much courage. And did he think he had done right? He said no, he'd done wrong, that he had a splitting headache over it, and he was running a fever from it. We asked if he were a follower of Jesus, and he said he belonged to the Methodist church, but he wasn't a very good member. We asked if he thought there was any similarity between his position and that of Judas, who sold the Lord for a bit of gain. He said, yes, but I feel more like Pilate. I just want to wash my hands. We said that tradition has it that Pilate is still trying to wash his hands. I know, he said, I know it's all wrong. He said he would help us make contact with another source of supply. We asked if it would be morally right for him, our longtime friend, to ask a stranger to do for us what he himself would not do. He said he thought it would not be right, so we asked him if it would be right for us in time of need to go to strangers with whom we'd not traded regularly when our friend with whom we had traded had refused to stand with us. He didn't think that would be right either. So we asked if he didn't want to reconsider his decision. He said no. We said we would be praying for him. He said, you're doing what Jesus taught, for he said to pray for your enemies, and I guess I'm your enemy. Friend or enemy, we said, you are an object of God's love and our love. We shook hands with him and said goodbye. Now that's the kind of in-your-face confrontations that he was accustomed to offering. Another characteristic of his approach to life was really his absolute grounding in New Testament. Absolute grounding in New Testament. Following his graduation from agricultural college, he went to the Baptist seminary in Louisville, Kentucky for 6 years, got his basic theological degree, then got a PhD in Greek New Testament. However, his academic career is a reflection of the way in which the New Testament was to define his thought and the claim of Jesus upon his life. Specifically, the way in which Jordan interprets the Sermon on the Mount and refused to allow the message to be compromised in his own life helps make his perspective a little bit more understandable. His goal was to be consistently faithful to the message, and this often placed him in direct conflict with the society in which he grew up. Clarence Jordan wasn't familiar with other intentional communities like the ones we've studied. His creation of Koinonia Farm was really on the fly, based upon his trying to live out what the New Testament said and to understand what Jesus wanted. When in seminary and graduate school, there were several aspects of his life and work that foreshadowed Koinonia Farm. In addition to his academic work, he had an active role in the life of his church. Through his school years and immediately afterwards, much of Clarence's work beyond academics focused on mission works with poor black congregations and the outreach of the denomination in areas of urban blight. Clarence became convinced that poor black farmers might not flee rural areas for the poverty of the city if they could be helped to find a way to sustain themselves on a farm. One of the stated goals of when Koinonia Farm was established in 1942 was, and I'm quoting them, to undertake to train Negro preachers in religion and agriculture, to provide an opportunity for Christian students to serve a period of apprenticeship in developing community life on the teachings and principles of Jesus, to seek to conserve the soil which we believe to be God's holy earth. Now it's hard for us to appreciate in 2026. This is 1942 in southern Georgia, 1942. It's before the Civil Rights Movement. Clarence was convinced his mission was in the rural South, and that a significant part of the rationale for his work was to lift tenant farmers beyond the poverty level. He was also convinced that his work had to confront racial boundaries in his native South. In addition, some of the economic principles upon which Koinonia would be based got their first trial in a fellowship of younger students which Clarence led. It was the first instance of Clarence defining his perspective using the New Testament term koinonia. Challenged by the utopian vision of that early church, remember the sermon I gave on Acts chapter 2 and 4, that really got into Clarence's mind and heart. The students established a bank account. Those who had extra income deposited the money, and those who had an emergency were able to withdraw money as they needed. Jordan had an optimistic view of human nature in the administration of the Koinonia account. He was sure that persons whose hearts had been transformed would participate in a way that was appropriate, giving what they were able and only taking what they really needed. The evolution of a plan for Koinonia Farm was advanced by Jordan's acquaintance in 1941 with an American Baptist missionary from Burma named Martin England, who was on leave from his assignment in Burma because of World War II. Jordan and England found that their perspectives were strikingly similar. As their friendship grew, the concept which would become Koinonia Farm emerged. Together they would take steps to found the new adventure. With financial backing from a Baptist layman named A.J. Stylberg, the Jordans, Clarence and Florence and their 2 children, and the Englands, Martin and Mabel and their 3 children, would prepare to begin the community. After an extensive and intentional search, in the fall of 1942, they settled on a 440-acre plot of land in Sumter County in southern Georgia, about 8 miles from Americus. The primary criteria was that the location for the experimenting community had to be typical of farming conditions in that area. Because of inadequate accommodations and limitations of the war placed on getting building materials, Florence and the Jordan children were not able to live with them immediately. Almost from the start, the goal of the community that was to be committed to racial equality created hostility in the wider community. The Jordans and the Englands had hired a black tenant farmer to help them. And according to their intention to be absolutely equal racially, they had lunch with the man. The Ku Klux Klan found out about it. The Ku Klux Klan found out about it. Almost immediately, they were visited by a hostile group delegation from the Ku Klux Klan. It was only by using inspired humor, politeness, and poise, Jordan was able to extricate himself from the confrontation. As he reflected on the event and others, and the fear they induced, this is how Jordan's perspective on confrontations with the Klan and others who, the violence is pretty dramatic as we go along in the story. It was not a question of whether or not we were to be scared, but whether or not we would be obedient. The revelation in the New Testament that God is no respecter of persons, that he is a God blind to externalities, was clear. There was no quarrel about it, and yet the church had just set this idea aside. We felt that whatever we did, we had to give this project to God on his terms. We knew this flew in the face of the Southern Code. We knew white men could disappear just like black men. It scared the hell out of us, but the alternative was not to do it, and that scared us even more. By early 1943, it was possible for the Jordan family to join them on the farm, and with Florence's arrival, the Jordans and Englands began to live under the economic plan, which was a part of the original vision. Under this concept of total community, described in the second chapter of Acts, everything was held in common and all income was defined as common income. Major and minor financial decisions, from buying a tractor to buying a pair of shoes, became a community decision. All economic decisions were made on a consensus basis. All were made on a consensus basis. Fuller told me that sometimes they would debate all night over whether somebody should get a new pair of shoes. And finally, Clarence Jordan would just get so tired he'd just go to bed. But nothing happened until the early 1960s. No economic decision, no matter how small, wasn't made except in community. Early on, Koinonia Farm was involved in its mission to raise sites of poor farmers. So a chicken operation was begun with the hope of providing an example of how egg production might be profitable to others. They assisted other farmers in setting up their own flocks. An egg breeding and marketing cooperative was set up. A mobile peanut harvester was developed by Jordan during World War II. Now, this is a significant issue that shows something about Clarence. He developed this mobile peanut harvester because labor supply was down during World War II. He refused to receive compensation for his invention, and within a few years, large implement manufacturers were producing models of his brainchild. He didn't patent it, he gave it away. Jordan also developed a hog farrowing barn and a system of planned farrowing. He made use of this motion picture equipment to show educational films to farmers on a variety of topics. A cow library was set up and poor families were permitted to check out a milk cow and return them when the cow went dry for a new one. In addition, over the years, Koinonia ran a camp and vacation Bible school for children in the area who were poor and predominantly black. In the early years of Koinonia's existence, Jordan also became a nationally known figure on the speaking circuit. A number of new young recruits to the Koinonia family were realized through these contacts. By 1950, there were 14 adults, plus a growing list of children, living at Koinonia Farm. At its largest, Koinonia Farm had about 60 persons living on site, 22 of whom were adults. Support from a large constituency throughout the country was to be an important factor in Koinonia's survival during years of economic boycott in the 1950s. By the end of 1954, Koinonia was mailing its newsletter to 1,500 people. By 1968, the mailing list was 12,000, and people around the country were supporting their experiment. Jordan and other founding members of the community acted very specifically out of their intention to be faithful to the message of Jesus as they understood it in the New Testament, not out of any understanding of historical community experience. They were really inventing as they went. Everything was trial and error for the first decade. The lack of rules was the rule. And there were few presuppositions that defined the community structure. It wasn't until 1951 that they developed a specific written pledge that was to be made by those who entered the community. And a pattern of probation was established for people who wanted to become a part of the community. It's also at this time that they made contact with the Hutterite and Bruderhof communities in the Dakotas and Western Canada. These communities responded in their structure to some of the inadequacies in Koinonia structure, and there were a number of people in Koinonia Farm who transferred to the Hutterites eventually. There were a number of aspects of community life that were established early on and continued until the failure of the community as it was planned in the early 1960s. It was established early on that there would be no racial lines at Koinonia, a practice that was adhered to strictly. Jordan realized that there could be no compromise on certain issues. Hence, the incident mentioned where Jordan spoke the KKK occurred within a few months of the community's beginning, but it happened over and over again. Membership in the community was open to persons of all races, and a number of black individuals and families were part of the community throughout its existence. The absolute commitment to racial inclusion became the primary, but not the only source of conflict with the wider community in which Koinonia found itself. A second principle of the community was the commitment to nonviolence. Koinonia became a place friendly to conscientious objectors and draft resistors during World War II. Think of this. During World War II, to be a haven for draft resistors placed them in conflict, as you can imagine. In 1948, when the United States instituted another peacetime draft, Clarence Jordan was supportive of those who felt he must resist the draft by those who felt they had to resist the draft by refusing to register. His support to these individuals also contributed to the accusation during the conflicts with the wider community in the 50s over Koinonia's racial policy that Jordan and others were communists. They were communists. Jordan had tried to register as a conscientious objector during World War II, but he was given an automatic ministerial deferment instead. The response of the Koinonia community to the hatred and violence leveled against them over the years was also a constant adherence to a principle. They adhered to the principle of nonviolence no matter how violent the community got against them. Various members of the Koinonia Farm were rejected, verbally assaulted, physically beaten, shot at, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Their facilities were bombed, but they never responded to violence with violence. They never bought a weapon. Never bought a weapon. By the same token, part of their commitment to nonviolence was their belief in the redemptive love, so they refused to relocate or move someplace else. Community survival did not come before witnessing to the gospel as they understood it. In other words, the first principle was, we're here to offer witness, and for us to run away means that we're not following the vision. Their position was that their job was to speak the truth in love. The confrontation with the butane dealer that I read is an example of what went on a lot of the time. Another characteristic of Koinonia from its beginning was common ownership of property. All who became full members of Koinonia Farm had to dispose of everything they owned, either by giving it to the community, giving it away to the poor, or giving it up to some other source. Characteristic of their perspective in this matter is Jordan's encounter with a 40-year-old spinster who was contemplating membership in the community and who, because of sizable assets, was reluctant to dispose of her wealth. Clarence insisted that she enter the fellowship without her wealth. When she suggested giving her wealth to Koinonia Farm, this is how he responded, and this is a quote. "No. If you put that money in here, several things would begin to happen. First of all, we'd quit growing peanuts and start discussing theology, and that would be good for us. In the second place, unless I miss my guess, you're a very lonely person, and you are lonely because you think every friend you have ever gotten is because they're after your money. Well, if you put that money in here, you would think we courted you for your money and that we loved you for your money. And in the next place, if you put that money in here, you would get the idea you were God's guardian angel, that you endowed the rest of us, and that all of us ought to be grateful to you for your beneficence. Now, for your sake and for our sakes, you get rid of that money and come and walk with us.
Get rid of that money.
If common ownership was the hallmark of the community, so was the distribution of goods according to need. Early on, when only two families at Koinonia were the Jordans and the English, they had a debate over whether or not each family should get an allowance every month. And that was decided that that's not the way it was in Acts. If they were going to do what it said in the book of Acts, they were going to do all of their goods communally. As I said, even the smallest decision involved the community. If one of the youth wanted to go into town and wanted some spending money, the whole community had to agree to give them spending money. Every single decision. Family needs and community needs were always put in tension because of the choice to make all economic expenditures by consensus. In fact, when the family allowance concept did begin to take hold in the early 1960s, it kind of broke up the original vision, and Koinonia Farm was never really the same after that. But from 42 to about 62, every decision was every financial decision was a community decision. Millard Fuller's told me that Clarence Jordan became a little bit disenchanted with the consensus process of making economic decisions because sometimes it resulted in really poor choices. They decided after, in 1954, there was a drought and everything in the farm dried up. And so they had a discussion about whether or not to install an irrigation system, which was not a good idea. The drought was a one-off. And they decided they went $30,000 in debt to put in an irrigation system that never was needed. And these consensus decisions they made didn't take advantage sometimes of the expertise of somebody in the group. But doing things by consensus was more important than making a good decision to them. You know? Okay, let's move on here. Fuller also told me that were it not for because of this consensus decision making, if it were not for the hostility of the community around them that forced them together for survival, they might not have made it if they'd been left alone and just been trying to go on, because it created so much tension financially for people. Now I need to talk about the violence of the community against them because it's pretty dramatic. The self-definition of Koinonia was advanced by the constant need to deal with the larger community and its persecution. The dominant reason for Sumter County's rejection of Koinonia Commune was its violation of the Southern ethos concerning race. But Jordan's anti-violence, anti-draft, anti-military perspective was also an issue, but the core issue was the race. In the first few years of Koinonia's existence, Jordan and the other members of the community tried to participate as regular members of the Rehoboth Baptist Church. In mid-1950, their continued participation was challenged by the church leadership, and in August of that year, there was a vote to expel them from the congregation. A key element in the charge brought by the Board of Deacons against Koinonia reads as follows. And this is the resolution that church made to expel them. Whereas Mr. and Mrs. C.L. Jordan, Miss Eleanor Jordan, Mr. and Mrs. Howard Johnson, and Miss Willie Pugh, members of Rehoboth Baptist Church, are also members of Koinonia Farm, an organization actively engaged in advocating views and practices contrary to those of other members of the Rehoboth Church. And whereas representatives of this group have brought people of other races into the services of Rehoboth Baptist Church, and have done this with the knowledge that such practices were not in accord with the practices of other members of the Rehoboth Church. And whereas said members do constantly visit Negro churches in the community and have persisted in holding service where both white and colored attend together, and whereas said members, because of these views and practices, have caused serious friction in our church and have disrupted the Christian unity and spirit which we previously prevailed, therefore we recommend that the Rehoboth Baptist Church do on this 13th day of August 1950 withdraw fellowship from any who are members of Koinonia Farm, and that their names be stricken from the church roll. Now, typical of Koinonia's response to such a rejection, the group attended worship the next week to show they loved the church. A delegation from the church informed the Koinonians they were unwelcome at church services, and the Koinonians agreed to stay if they would be allowed to read a statement to the church. And the statement they delivered is this: "It is our desire that it be clearly understood that our absence would be due not to any malice or lack of forgiveness or willingness to attend on our part, but to the will and action of the church itself. We wish to extend to the pastor, the deacons, and the entire membership our sincere sympathy in these hours of suffering. We are grieved that it has become impossible for us to walk together as brethren in the Lord Jesus. Truly, both you and we have broken Jesus' heart, and we all should penitently seek his forgiveness. It is our fervent prayer that all of us shall heed the command of our Lord Jesus to forgive each other until 70 times 7, to pray for one another, and to love those who despitefully use you. May there be a ready willingness for reconciliation which would involve no sacrifice of conscience or compromise our Lord's truth." Members of Koinonia community had little more success at being welcomed than other white churches in the community, especially after the hostility against Koinonia began to erupt in serious violence in the mid-1950s. The rejection of the Rehoboth Baptist Church was but a mild form of the hostility that would be directed against them. The full force of the Whiters community rejection of Koinonia Farm became felt in 1956 and 57 through an economic boycott, violence, and legal harassment. The initiating event that precipitated all the acute hostility was Clarence's recommendation of 2 black students for admission to Georgia State College of Business in Atlanta. The students needed a recommendation from 2 state school alumni, and Clarence readily agreed to offer his support. The school had been segregated, but remember in 1954, the Supreme Court decision made it clear that they were eligible to apply. While Clarence was declared ineligible to sign the application on technicality, it was reported in the Sumter County paper, the Americas Times Recorder, that he had done so. After this report, which was inaccurate, Koinonia became the target of threats, increasingly serious vandalism, and economic boycott and legal harassment. Fences were cut repeatedly on the farm, signs advertising Koinonia roadside market were torn down, sugar was placed in their gas tanks of their vehicles, 300 fruit trees were chopped down by vandals, shots were fired into the roadside market, and eventually it was bombed in July 26, 1956. The economic boycott destroyed the farm's egg business and eventually made it impossible to raise field crops. Supplies and materials could not be bought, the products could not be sold, insurance was canceled, the banks would not serve them, merchants refused to work on their machinery. Koinonians were able to survive the boycott because of the wide support they were getting from around the country and a shift to a business focused on the mail order of pecans. Pecans were sold wholesale at state auctions, so Koinonians could not be boycotted. The market for pecans was primarily outside Georgia. The pecan shelling equipment was run by electricity from REA, so this source of power could not be denied them. The mails were available to them, and so they marketed their pecans with this slogan, and I love this: "Help us get the nuts out of Georgia." Legal harassment took the form of Sumter County Commissioners blocking the opening of Camp Koinonia, which was a summer opportunity planned for about 30 inner-city children, which had been a success in the past. The Koinonians' response to the escalating situation was to take out an ad in the America's Times Recorder. In the ad, they explained themselves and pledged to respect the rights of those who disagreed with them. They asked for the same consideration from others. In response, now this is a signed ad was placed by a citizen. They put their name on it, which was clearly proved by the events that followed to express the general attitude of the county. It said, if the advertisement about Koinonia was an attempt to make the good people of Sumter County sway from their way of thinking or bow their heads in shame, then I am sure I speak for the masses when I say the result was not reached. I would welcome Koinonia moving to a place well above the Mason-Dixon line. If I knew that I were living in an area where the bulk of the people did not want me, you can be sure I would move away. Somebody signed that ad. Ultimately, the violence became focused on the individuals at Koinonia, as well as their property. Shots were fired not only at the property, but eventually at them. Clarence and Florence's 14-year-old son faced such threats and abuse that he was sent to live with a Hutterite community in Forest River, North Dakota for a year. It would be difficult to fully characterize the weight of this campaign of terror on them in the time we have to talk here, but the effect was to produce a situation of constant tension that they lived under. In January of 1957, the Koinonians held a 10-day meeting of the adult members of their group to decide whether or not to stay or relocate someplace else. But they decided they had to stay. And more violence followed. On January 29, 1957, there was a machine gun attack on the homes at Koinonia Farm. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but there were several near misses. Other gunfire attacks occurred. On February 24th of 1957, following a Ku Klux Klan rally in Americus, a motorcade of 70 to 80 cars showed up at Koinonia Farm. The confrontation that ensued was short and tense, but there wasn't any violence. Violence and threats continued, and one of Koinonia's black families, Rufus Angry and his family, did decide they had to move away, and so they moved to his family in New Jersey. They just couldn't take it. In the spring of 1957, the Sumter County grand jury investigated Koinonia, and while they returned no indictments, they published a report that implied that Koinonia Farm was a nest of communists, that they had staged the violence against themselves for publicity. A report of the grand jury was published not only locally, but was sent to various state and federal officials. Koinonia tried to purchase advertising space in the local paper to respond to the report, but the paper wouldn't give them space. And so they mailed their response to everyone in the Sumter County phone book. In May of 1957, a feed store chain headquartered in Macon, Georgia, was owned by Herbert Birdsey, and he announced his intention to trade with Koinonia at his America store. There was hope that the economic boycott was softening, but on May 19th, that store was destroyed by a bomb. A big bomb that not only damaged the Birdsey flour and seed feed, but also 4 adjacent stores, the bank, and the courthouse. The owner of the chain made a decision to leave Americus. Following the feed store explosion, a delegation from the Americus and Sumter County Chamber of Commerce came to Koinonia Farm on 2 occasions and tried to persuade them to move someplace else, but they refused. In the 3 years that followed, the pecan business enabled Koinonia to survive. There were sporadic threats of violence against the members of the community, and legal harassment continued in various forms. However, internal divisions and doubts began to take their toll on this group. You gotta imagine it would. Since the mid-50s, the group had an ongoing relationship with Hutterites and Bruderhof communities I mentioned. The Hutterites were a communal sect founded primarily in North and South Dakota, Montana, and Western Canada. Their origins can be traced back to the time of the Protestant Reformation and the Anabaptist movement. They're named for Jacob Hutter, who was a martyr of their movement. After experiencing persecution in Austria and Russia, the group migrated to the United States in the 1870s. At the time of Koinonia Farm's struggle in Georgia, they numbered 20,000 persons in 200 communities. 20,000 persons in 200 colonies. The Society of Brothers, or the Bruderhof, began in Germany after World War I. As the Bruderhof tried to find a style of living consistent with their New Testament faith, they also began to live communally. Because of Nazi persecution, they fled first to England in 1937 and then to Paraguay after the outbreak of World War II. And in the 1950s, members of Bruderhof became permanent visitors at the Hutterite community in Forest River, South Dakota. Koinonia, the Hutterites, and the Bruderhof began to develop a relationship with each other, which included mutual aid. At one point, Koinonia furnished a teacher for the Hutterite colony in Forest River, North Dakota. During the drought of 1954, the Hutterites provided Koinonia with a tractor, a truck, and a loan of several $1,000s. And when the violence against Clarence and Lawrence's 14-year-old son became a serious concern, he was sent to live with the Hutterites. Over the course of the ongoing relationship, persons from Koinonia lived for a time in the Hutterite colonies, and some of the Hutterites came and lived at Koinonia Farm. Clarence was one of the few quote-unquote Englishmen ever accepted as a preacher among the Hutterites. Miller Fuller shared with me that Clarence, through his interpretation of the prodigal son, was able to persuade the Hutterites to stop punishing young people who left their group and then returned for readmission. One consequence of the developing relationship was that a member of a Koinonia family began to experience the Hutterite communities something that they found lacking in Koinonia, and that was order and structure, and some sense of hierarchy to how decision-making was made. And so there were a number of people at Koinonia who permanently became Hutterite in this process. The Hutterite practice of admonishment, correcting one another, and speaking frankly, short-circuited some of the tensions and resentments that were present at Koinonia. In addition, Koinonians who visit Forest River felt there was greater unity in the Hutterite community because individual desires were sublimated to a common purpose. At Koinonia, while decisions were arrived by consensus, resentments did linger after decisions were made. I could picture some teenager wanting $5 to go into town and buy a Coke or something, and the resentment of not getting it. The commitment to consensus decision-making is one reason Koinonia did not seriously become a Hutterite group itself, since Clarence would have to be an official minister if he did that. In the early 60s, Koinonia shifted his decision-making process and adopted the family allowance concept. And that began the demise of the community as it was first visioned. As the community floundered at the end of the 50s and into the early 60s, Jordan became restless and driven to find a new focus. The result of his personal struggle was the production of his cotton patch version of the Gospels. He died of a heart attack on October 29th, 1969, while he was in his writing cabin. And with his death, a lot of the glue that, he was charismatic, a lot of the glue that held the community together was not there to keep it going. And it really was never the same between 1942 and 1962. That culture essentially died with Clarence's death. And I think that kind of concludes the gist of what that community is like. This is so different from the other groups we studied, in part because there was no authority figure that had absolute control. At Oneida, if there was a problem, you asked John Humphrey Noyes. At Amana, it was the Werkzug and the trustees you could trust to make a decision for you. In the Shakers, you know, the elaborate structure of the deacons and the et cetera, formed, I guess we all need to have some sense that there's a structure where there's a place where decisions get finalized. But I find this is a really amazing story. And I cannot imagine the amount of courage and tenacity that this took to pull off for 20 years, especially in the 1940s and early 50s. It's quite a story.
When they came apart, what happened to the farm?
I think Koinonia still exists in a form.
In a form, yeah. There's a farm and a store still there. We visited.
But they don't live communally anymore.
No.
Okay.
And, but I think, Jimmy Carter was influenced by, they did develop later on what was called Koinonia Partners, and it was out of Koinonia Partners that Habitat for Humanity grew. And Millard Fuller was at a time part of Koinonia Farm. Fuller was an executive, and he became disenchanted with the corporate world and went to Koinonia. And he was such a great organizer. I mean, Habitat now is worldwide, isn't it?
Yes.
It's worldwide. And this all grew out of this impulse that we've been talking about here. So maybe Koinonia Farm's heritage is not just what they did in their time, but what they started that is rolling and rolling and rolling.
They
Now,
still
I
have
gave
lots
you,
of pecan trees.
Pardon?
They still have lots of pecan trees and lots of pecan products in their store.
And you can order them online.
You can order them online. But I love their marketing. Get the nuts out of Georgia. Yeah.
I think it's interesting too, the support they had from the wider population, the country that was supporting what they were trying to do in the midst of all that
Right, I think
violence.
the impulse for civil rights was growing in other parts of the country, and Clarence was a very charismatic speaker too, and so part of what sustained them was he was sometimes on the road speaking. Yeah.
Well, I just read a book about the Little Rock Nine, the students that,
Right.
first students that went to Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the support. This was written by one of the students that went, she's now an adult, but they were getting support too from
All over the country.
all over the country.
Right.
And they were the violence and the persecution was very similar right where they were, but.
Geographically, this was real close to Plains, Georgia.
Correct.
Because, Americus, we heard a lot about when he was president.
Right. And I think Jimmy Carter's involvement in Habitat also boosted it as well. To see a former president driving nails to build a house, I think encouraged other people to see themselves as potentially involved in Habitat.
When Carter was running for president, he distanced himself somewhat from Koinonia, but they said Amy still, to this day, was very involved, and she would come out and buy lots of gifts at Christmas time, and,
Right. I mean, I can't picture how difficult it was in the early part of this to assist other farmers when you can barely make a go of it yourself. Have a cow library. I mean, I grew up on a dairy farm.
That is
You know what kind of resources it would take to do something like that? I mean, they were giving away all of their resources. They really were.
I mean, we can't go to the public library and check out a cow? I thought
We can,
I thought maybe we could.
Can build a 3D one.
Yeah, you bet.
Grab a book and out of book.
Right, yeah. The thing about the pecans was making me wonder, there's the obvious racism involved, but also I wondered, was the farm perceived, do you think, as an economic threat to the farmers in the area, since they're obviously producing things without?
I think the racial thing was so upfront
Sure.
that was really what was going on there.
Yeah,
How different would it might have been if it hadn't been,
Pardon?
deep in the South?
Right.
I mean, if it had been started, in like the Dakotas or somewhere.
If it had
where
been
it
started
wasn't so racial.
someplace else, Fuller convinced me that their process of consensus decision-making would have caused the group to break up much sooner. He really emphasized to me, I can't find the record, I recorded the interview with him, and it's someplace in a box in my basement that I can't find. But he convinced me that it really was the outside threat that held them together through the worst of this, even though internally the conflict over how they handled money was a growing issue. Imagine you have multiple families together with multiple teenagers, and you try to make all decisions communally. That's gotta be, it's hard enough in one household to make decisions with teenagers. So, anyway, yeah.
kind of reminded me also, this is the stuff coming from what I teach, but it's an awful lot like the States during the Revolutionary War. That they held together under the first kind of government that we had, the Articles of Confederation, because they had the threat of the war. But as soon as the threat of the war was over, they started
Having trouble.
having trouble.
Right.
Trade wars between states
Right.
and so on, yeah, so it's very similar kind of.
And each of the communes we've discussed, there is a personality that helps form that community. Now, in this case, Clarence didn't choose to be a dictator, although he was accused of it many times by other people in the group. And, but all of these communities are focused on the leader. Now, next week, we're going to be talking about something entirely different, which is not a commune, but it's a perfectionist group. And that is the Methodist class meeting as it functioned in the period 1800 to 1850. This was a group that was as focused on creating the perfect Christian response to life as any of these other communities. But it was not a commune. The goal was for people to move on to perfection. And the class leader was the key element in this whole process. The class meetings were very, as you'll find out next week if you show up, were very much a bearing of everybody's soul. When I did this curriculum in another church, someone said to me after we did the Methodist class meeting session, he said to me, that degree of spiritual intimacy is very attractive to me, but it scares me to death. Because people in this town only show you what they want you to, what you want them to see. And it requires a kind of honesty that is very rare in social settings. I found a copy published in 1850 of the directions for the class leader. It's a complete book, and it's an amazing document. If I can find it in my boxes, I'll bring it next week. But anyway, Any other thoughts about Koinonia Farm or any of the other groups we've talked about? Now, I should tell you that this is a minor part of what my doctoral project was about, because the doctoral project was about how these historical materials could be used to raise self-awareness in congregations, which involved me having a test group that was exposed to the curriculum and another group that was not. It involved professionally planned surveys before the curriculum was presented and after the curriculum was presented. And part of what I'm not doing with you that I did with them was at each class session, there were 2 case studies I asked them to analyze out of the history of the community and to identify the ways in which those case studies were done. And then they had these discussions that they had were all taped and they were all transcribed. 250 pages of my doctoral project is single-spaced of all these verbatims. And Pastor Ritkers was very interested in seeing the book because he grew up in that community.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, but
And I said to him, well, the participants in the discussion are not named by name, just by their initials. But he figured someone might. Anyway,
We were hoping
interesting.
it wouldn't be a test, that was.
well, it wasn't a test, so the surveys were really just to see where people were at before they were exposed to the curriculum, where they were at after the curriculum. And by the way, each of these sessions that I've given you, because of the nature of what I wanted to do in the doctoral project, a church historian had to approve each of these curriculums that I've shared with you. I have the letters back and forth with the guy, but anyway.
Interesting.
My dissertation has been widely read. There are 5 copies known to be in existence. 2 of them in my house, 1 of them in a friend's house, 1 in the Library of Congress, and 1 at Princeton Theological Seminary. So, anyway.
Do you know where that is at the house?
Pardon?
Do you know where that is at the house?
Yes, I said.
It's next to the recording.
I know because I loaned it to
They're in
David
the
Rickers
same
to look
box.
at.
Underneath, okay.
I loaned it to David Rickers to look at. Anyway,
Thank you.
any other things for today? What time is it?
Quarter after.
4:50. I think it's time for us to go home.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Uh,
See you next week.